Welcome back to this special run of episodes of Two Who's Review leading up to the 60th anniversary of Doctor Who. I'm Alex,
I'm Fitz.
and today we are doing something new on our little podcast here. For the first time ever, we are reviewing a Big Finish audio drama. Um,
Mm,
so, from 1999, that's when they started, which is insane that they've been going that long.
mm.
Um, in the absence of Doctor Who on TV, and after the TV movie didn't spawn a new show, Big Finish, who are an audio drama company in England, started producing Doctor Who audio dramas.
Mm,
And anyone who is a fan has at least heard of them by osmosis.
mm,
But some of us haven't really consumed a lot of their media before.
mm.
Me being one of them. I listened to this story today,
Mm.
and it's the first time I've ever listened to a Big Finish story.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, I haven't listened to any of them before.
Mm,
Um, and look, I know that because of the way media works, they're not all going to be this level of quality.
mm.
But this was a really great first impression.
Oh no, this is amazing. I'll see how I feel at the end of this. There are maybe a couple of things in terms of flaws, I may bring up, but certainly because I've listened to this twice in 2 days. The first time listening to it, by the time I got to the end, I'm like, yeah, I don't think masterpiece is too much of an exaggeration. Because yeah, even if it's not, perfect, well, I mean, there's no such thing as a perfect story, but
Yep.
it is still really, really good. Um, yeah, I mean, I know I've heard this has quite a good reputation,
Oh yeah.
but it's well deserved because this story, i- it's doing, it's doing a lot. Um, but I think probably its biggest strength is how thematically rich it is. This is
Oh yeah.
dealing with a lot of different really complex themes. And the most amazing part about it is that they all come together pretty cohesively, even the themes that aren't explored in like extreme detail, um, or aren't given like a lot of space.
Mhm.
They still feel satisfying. They're
Yeah,
doing
definitely.
they work well enough for their place in the story, and they really allow you to think, which is
I
really
should
great.
Yeah, I should explain it because I don't think I've actually said what the name of the story is yet. The
Yeah.
story's called Davros, and it is fitting for a number of different reasons that we are
Yes.
looking at this story at this time.
Mm,
For regular podcast listeners, earlier this year we did a mini marathon of all of the classic era TV stories which featured Davros.
mm,
So that ties into our previous season of podcasting. But another thing is that this story was originally produced to celebrate the 40th anniversary of Doctor Who. It came out in September of 2003, and it
yep.
was part of a trilogy alongside the stories that are called Omega and Master that was
Mm,
specifically made to celebrate the 40th anniversary. And so, I mean, 60th anniversary year, and also the year where we've already examined Davros in a lot of detail,
mm.
the stars aligned for us to look at this now.
Yeah. Pretty much.
Um, I know there's probably going to be quite a lot of people who haven't heard this yet, because like I said, I also haven't heard this story before. So to that effect, in the description of this podcast, either on YouTube or on your podcasting app, I will be putting a link to the Big Finish Productions website where
Mm,
you can purchase this audio drama. I purchased it for a little over $3 Australian, so it was
well.
very, very cheap, and it's definitely worth it.
Oh yeah.
Give it a listen if you can. If you want to pause this episode, go listen to it. It is 2.5 hours, so that'll be your day. Um,
Yeah.
but there'll be plenty of time for you to come back and listen to this if you want to listen to that story first.
Mm,
Um, it is, and that's your spoiler warning, by the way. I'm not gonna. We don't
yeah.
normally do them because it's sort of implied, I guess.
Yeah.
But I will just because I do think that this is really worth listening to on your own before you
Yeah. I agree.
come back and listen to us here. Um, I am so impressed that this story manages to stand above much of what came before it. And what I mean by that is it's the only, and I looked this up, this is the only ever story in any form of media that features Davros but no Daleks.
Yeah. Yeah, that sounds
And
about right.
yeah, and you would expect that that would be less thematically rich, right? Because they are
Mm,
so tied together.
mm.
They have similar ethoses, not exactly matching, but they certainly a lot of the time have the same line of thinking.
Oh yeah, same disturbing fascist undertone, same
Hmm.
society that created them. He's their creator, so obviously there's going to be a lot of sort of psychological overlap, I suppose
Yeah,
to say.
and I found it incredibly interesting that removing the Daleks from the context of this story. I mean, they're a part of the background, and they're not missing, but you don't feel their absence. But more than anything, removing Davros from the Daleks allows those themes to be explored even more,
Yeah.
and that's really strange because, like I said, they are so tied together. And normally, like Genesis is a perfect example.
Mm,
Like them, both Davros and the Daleks being there strengthened the thematic complexities with each other.
yeah.
But
I
here, it's
mm.
like they allow Davros to sort of stand on his own a little bit more, and
Yeah, I
not always rely on the Daleks for his Machiavellian ways.
yeah, I mean he's relying more on, the instincts of corporate greed, which is kind of great
Yeah,
in
it's
its own way.
fascinating, isn't it? Like you
Um
don't expect. I didn't expect that anyway. This. Well, I mean, it's obvious in hindsight, but
mm,
this warmongering fascist dictator relying on corporate greed to further his own goals. I mean, duh.
yeah. It's interesting to say about how sort of thematically the Daleks and Davros sort of complement each other, and that's certainly true in when a story's written well, like in
Mm.
Genesis. Um, but I wonder, in a way, like, could you argue that yes, they complement each other, but only in certain ways? So, like
Yeah.
as you say, like the huge benefit of removing the Daleks from this story is so that you can do things with Davros that you couldn't really do with the Daleks all that well, because because Davros, excuse me, is I don't think it's unfair to say that he's more of a three-dimensional character. Certainly, he's allowed to be more of a three-dimensional
Yeah.
character than most Daleks are,
100%. Yeah.
um, simply because of how they are and how they're created. So I think
Well, that's
it that
fascinating, isn't it?
mm,
Because I look back at a lot of the Davros stories we looked at earlier this year.
mm,
And I remember I have like similar complaints about some of them. Revelation of the Daleks, for example, I felt that the Daleks in that story were not needed, and
mm,
Davros was the main figure there, and the Daleks were kind of an
yeah,
afterthought.
sure.
With Remembrance, it was almost the opposite, where the Daleks were the main fixture, but then
And
Davros
Davros is just kind
only
of there.
was just
Yeah,
kind of there. Yeah, so
yeah,
I get what you mean. Like it's not always a given that putting both in the same story is going to benefit both. Sometimes it'll just be a like with anything where you put too much,
mm,
we overstuff a story and not and one or both elements don't get enough
yeah.
focus.
Too much of a good thing, and
Yeah,
it just
exactly.
and like even with something like Remembrance, which is a story we both really enjoyed, like Davros being included in it, it didn't detract from the story in any way, but
No.
you feel like they almost just got lucky with that. Like it's so easy, I think, to overstuff a story and to really just completely mess it up if you've got all these, really great sort of ideas that may not work well together.
Mm.
So, as you kind of suggest, this story kind of proves, at least shows some of the benefits of, again, taking Davros away from the Daleks and sort of dealing with him on his own.
Yeah. Before we do the timescales, because there is bizarrely still timescale stuff to look at with audio stuff. Um, I've got some trivia about this story, which I think is pretty interesting. Um,
Mm.
so one of the main actors in this is Wendy
Yeah,
Padbury,
Wenry Padbury.
who
Mm.
plays the wife of the CEO and a Davros apologist, which
Yeah,
was interesting
which,
to hear.
uh,
But she, as
yeah,
an actor, was previously a companion on the show. She played the second Doctor's companion, Zoe, in
Mm-hmm.
the last 2 years of his run. Um,
Mm.
which is interesting. I didn't well of course I didn't recognize her because I haven't seen Zoe in anything apart from the Five Doctors, which was a very minor appearance.
No,
But it
wasn't
does,
she in the Crotons?
or maybe see that's how forgettable the Crotons was. I just completely
Yeah, I mean, fair enough. Yeah. Anyway.
yeah, but I found it interesting when figuring that out, and I was like, well,
Mm.
I guess that's like knowing now that it's a 40th anniversary story, bringing in a previous actor for not necessarily the same role makes some kind of sense because you can get away with that in audio,
Yeah. Yeah.
where it's just like a little nod to it, I
Mm-hmm.
suppose.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, I also have noted here that chronologically, this is the earliest audio drama to feature the Sixth Doctor. So I don't think it was the
Yes.
first Sixth Doctor audio drama they produced, but in the timeline of the audio dramas, this is the first.
Oh yeah. No, that makes sense. Yep.
Um, see, there's a couple more things. No Perry in this story. The Sixth Doctor is companionless
Mm-hmm.
here, which I think is also pretty clever. For one thing, it's Davros without the Daleks, the Doctor without a companion. There's a
Yeah.
small level of mirroring there, but
Sure.
also it allows the Sixth Doctor to not be a complete asshole to his companion for once, which is
Well, and that's the thing, right? Um, I don't think that's the core of the issue here, although that is a point. But I think it's mainly just because this is the first time we've got a story with Colin Baker that's, good.
good. Yeah, exactly. I was gonna get to that, and
Yeah.
we've alluded in the past, and that many people have said that uh, Colin Baker's Doctor got given a second chance on Big Finish,
Yeah.
where his TV stories were, to put it nicely, bad.
Yeah.
And we've certainly experienced that with our limited watching of Colin Baker's stories in the
Mm.
past. We've certainly seen two. Neither of them were that impressive in my eyes. Um,
3.
Three.
3 Colin Baker TV stories.
Yeah, what was the third one? We did Attack of
Um,
the Cybermen. Oh, Two
Revelation, the
Doctors.
two
Right, yeah.
doctors.
Jesus, I completely blocked that one out too.
Is the trauma? Is it all coming back? Are you having
Oh,
flashbacks?
no. Fuck. Well, three at least, and none of them were that impressive, or as it turns out, memorable. But here, like they haven't, and it's something that I've heard said before. Again, most of this was secondhand until today, because again,
Mm.
first Big Finish story. They kept aspects of his Doctor's personality
Yeah,
while
for sure.
getting rid of the rough edges,
Yeah,
and it's resulted in this Doctor being actually like really entertaining. Like he fits really
absolutely.
well in this story.
Yeah, it's very interesting, but we've talked before. I think you first mentioned it, but if you look at some of Chibnall's stories, the issue is that all these characters are being written at a surface level. I would argue it's maybe not to the same intensity, but certainly the same principle that's being applied to the Sixth Doctor in the
Mm,
TV stories. Because beyond him being, oh boy, I'm the wacky guy saying random shit and I'm being an asshole, let's laugh at that. Beyond that, what amount of character does he have? But
mm.
here there are surface similarities, but the
Yeah,
core of the characterization in this version is much deeper, much more meaningful, has much more substance, really, because
yeah.
you
Well,
have many instances where the Sixth Doctor in this story is being a bit of an asshole, and
yeah,
more so than they rather are in other incarnations, but it it's great in that sense because it allows this Sixth Doctor to be the Sixth Doctor to stand out, but the core of his personality is still based on those core principles of compassion, um and justice and
yeah.
equality that
They've
the Doctor has always held. He's not saying to people, yeah, no, just fucking shoot him in the face,
yeah
whatever.
they've kept the they've kept the pompous and arrogant nature of
Mm,
this Doctor, whilst sanding away some of the more unpleasant aspects that the
yeah, for
character
sure.
had while on TV, and it's resulted in this Doctor like being the Doctor now.
Yeah,
if we'd gotten this version of the Sixth Doctor on TV, I would have been very happy, and I think Colin Baker would have had way more of a chance because he didn't deserve the treatment that
No,
he got
he
at the
didn't.
time.
He didn't.
And I really hope that Jodie gets that kind of second go at it at some
Yeah,
point
I
down the
agree.
line,
Yeah,
because that would be really great to see. Actually,
it
but going
would.
to the timescales, out of 283 votes, which is interesting. I don't know if I'll have to look at other TV stories, but don't remember stories getting that many votes in the past. Maybe they have, maybe they haven't. But out of 283 votes, Davros has an average rating of 9.1.
We'll see how I feel by the end of this podcast. I'm slightly tempted to say that's a little low. Just slightly.
Sure. I think it's more become clear with our discussion. I mean, I think it certainly earns its good reputation no matter what.
Yeah.
I think you'll find interesting that on the timescales, when sorting through all of the Big Finish monthly audio dramas that came out starring Colin Baker's Doctor, this is the second highest rated.
What was the first? I'm rather
It's
curious.
a story that's called The Holy Terror.
I don't think I've heard of it.
It was the 14th one they ever made. I'm going to look it up now because I think it's interesting.
Sure.
The Holy Terror came out in the year 2000.
Mm-hmm.
Here we go. Okay, so this is interesting. The Sixth Doctor and Frobisher become involved in a power struggle in a mysterious castle, culminating in a bloodbath. Drawing inspiration from Shakespearean tragedy, as well as exploring unpleasant elements of the father-child relationship and infanticide, this is one of the darker episodes. This is the first Doctor Who audio story to feature Frobisher, who is apparently a regular character from Doctor Who magazine's comic strip in the mid-1980s. And it addresses issues of crime and retribution, self-determinacy, religious extremism, and custom.
Wow, that's a lot.
Yeah, it seems pretty heavy. Let me just look up Frobisher now. Okay, Frobisher doesn't have his own entry on Wikipedia, which isn't very surprising. It took me straight to Doctor Who magazine. Frobisher. Frobisher is a shape-changing companion of the 6th and 7th Doctors.
Interesting.
Okay. That might be worth investigation at some point, because the fact that Frobisher got a special mention on this this Wikipedia page for the Holy Terror. I mean, I'm certainly intrigued about by the Holy Terror based on this description. I mean, also given that it's apparently better viewed than Davros.
I'll have to take a look at that at some point.
Yeah. Okay, but back to timescales.
Sure.
This episode has a 9 for plot.
Yeah, I mean, again, there may be one or two things that seem to lack clarity for me, but that could just be a me thing. We'll discuss it in detail when we get to it. But generally speaking, yeah, the plot's pretty damn good.
Well, let's put it this way, right? This, like I said before, this is a 2.5-hour story. Now, putting that in perspective, this means that this episode would have been 6
Yeah,
regular
6. It would have been a
episodes?
6-parter.
Yeah.
It's as long as Genesis. Let's put it that way.
Okay, sure. And if this was a 6-parter, like, I would argue that there's really no wasted time in it.
Yeah.
Like, nothing feels like it was unnecessary.
No.
Nothing feels out of place. Everything is working in service of the narrative and the characters. So by that metric, yeah, plot succeeds easily.
Yeah, for sure.
Let's have a look. It has a 9.6 for acting.
Yeah, I mean, the performances are great.
Yeah,
Yeah.
outstanding.
Really quite a masterclass from Terry Malloy.
Oh, yeah.
You can see, and maybe it is partly because of the reputation he helped build with the Big Finish audio stuff, but I think you can see why he's sort of, I assume at least, like liked as he is.
Yeah.
In the fan base, because he and if you watch like interviews with him, he really starts to he shows that he really understands this character and what he's about. Um, Clearly, an actor who cares about his performances, which is
Yeah.
really, really great. And that all comes across here because there's a lot of, and I think I probably said this with Revelation. It is very easy to make Davros just a cartoon character. We saw this with Destiny, but there's a lot of nuances to him, and I
Mm.
think it takes a good performance like the one done by Terry Malloy and good writing such as the one done by Eric Saywood, and I'm kicking myself for not remembering who wrote this, but
Lance Parkin.
pardon,
Lance Parkin.
Lance Parkin. It takes though both of those things to really sort of draw out those nuances, and of course, he is who he is. He does have his fun, maniacal, ranty moments, but there's so much more to that.
Mm.
This is fittingly, with a name like Davros, this is very much a character study of him.
Yeah,
Um,
definitely.
it is very much a Davros story, which is
Yeah, 100%.
really great that they chose to do that because I honestly think, in terms of like the way he is framed in the narrative and the way themes are explored through him, fittingly, I do think actually this is probably the best like Davros story that we've seen in the sense that yes, obviously there are the other Davros stories. Some of them were really great, Genesis and Remembrance in particular, but they're Davros and Dalek stories. This
Yeah,
is the best, Davros story that we've come across so far.
I think I would agree with that. Yeah.
Yeah.
9 for effects. I mean, look, it's a little bit easier to praise the effects here because we don't have to be like, well, this hasn't aged very well, or oh, I didn't look
well,
very convincing.
well,
But
that's the
like
thing. So you
the
go ahead.
sound of, well, but yeah, it's hard to. You got to remember that like with an audio drama like this, it's still got to be convincing enough with its audio.
Yeah, for sure. Especially given that, this is like people may say, oh, it's like an audiobook, but not really. It's a lot closer to old radio dramas. Like
Yeah, yeah.
they had in I think between the late 80s and the late 90s, the BBC had they basically adapted all of the Chronicles of Narnia for radio, which incidentally had Sylvester McCoy in it. But anyway,
Well, that's
so
also the original form of Hitchhiker's Guide, isn't it?
is it?
Well, before it was a movie, they did audio. They did it as a
Yeah,
radio
okay, yeah,
thing.
no, that makes sense.
I think it was probably a book first, but
Yeah, and then yeah, that makes sense. In any case, that's what this is. You'll notice there's no narrator. It's not like listening to the old audio recordings from the Lost episodes in which they would get an actor from that story, usually one of the companions, to narrate the story. But there's
yeah,
none of that here. You have to go by um in a way it's an even more difficult thing to pull off than television because you've got no visual, you've only got, sound and voice. And the fact that they're able to make it work as well as they do is quite admirable. The special effects, you know, they're not visual, but insofar as they are special effects, they're all very convincing. They work both in the sense that they sound like Doctor Who sound effects. Like it
yeah,
sounds like
yeah.
stuff that came straight out of the radiophonic workshop in the 80s,
Well, yeah,
which
that's.
is
I think that's actually the thing that's more impressive about it is
mm,
that they didn't feel the need to sort of like it feels like this was a story from the Colin Baker era that they
yeah,
just put they just removed this video screen from. They didn't
mm,
feel the need to update like any of the sounds. Like to the point where the audio of the theme song is still the same as it would have been while Perry was still a companion.
yeah,
Um, like they could have like made entirely new sounds that were more to the era of the early 2000s, but they didn't. They chose to try and replicate those of the mid 80s.
yeah. It's there's a nostalgia factor obviously coming in there, but
Yeah,
I think it's also just sort of a confidence, I suppose, in the world building, in that they know, there's a heritage here that they're sort of um sort of being steward for, I guess.
It's not
But
only that, but it makes the story feel way more legitimate in the larger world as well. It's
for
because
sure, yeah,
doing that, it makes it less like we have the Doctor Who IP, let's do our own thing with it. It's we have the Doctor Who IP, let's add to it. Let's
yeah,
pretend that we have like as much control over this world as the BBC would have had in the 80s, and
yeah, for
let's
sure.
add to the depth that that world has, and really like you could just like line up all the audio dramas with when they would have taken place in the original TV series timeline and intersperse them in your regular viewing. Like if for some reason
Mm,
you were mad enough to do a binge of all of Doctor Who from
mm,
1963 to 2023 and add in the audio dramas chronologically where they would go, it would take your life, but it would fit and it would seem
for sure.
completely like it wouldn't be out of place at all, except for the fact that you're missing one of your other senses for some of them.
Well, and that's interesting because chronologically, I'm very certain this takes place between Resurrection and Revelation.
It does, yeah.
Yeah. So, but like the fact that it slots in that easily and expands on the world building.
And it's also like I'm not sure how aware you will be of this, but there's clearly a mutual respect for both sides as well. Because in 10 years ago, when in leading up to the 50th anniversary, they put out that short 4 minute thing with Paul McGann in it to sort of tie together the War Doctor's beginnings before the 50th
Mm,
anniversary special.
yeah, yeah.
Um, Before the Eighth Doctor regenerates, he mentions several of his companions from the Big Finish audio dramas.
Mm.
Um, so there's clearly that respect the other way as well. And I think that was the first and possibly only time that the TV universe has acknowledged Big Finish as canon.
Yeah, I'm not. Yeah, I'm certainly not aware of any other time it's done
Mm.
that.
And it's interesting that that happened for the 50th, and now for the 60th, they're about to acknowledge uh, a lot of the other extended universe stuff as canon with Beep the Meep and the Wrath Warriors and that.
Yeah,
It's just like this really nice tying together of all these different mediums for
yeah.
anniversaries, which is nice.
Mm.
Um, Davros has an 8.8 for replay value.
Um, Again, maybe a bit higher for me. I
Mhm.
found that this was maybe not as like viscerally gripping as it was the first time, but that was mainly because I was sort of in analysis mode the second time, and the thematic richness is still all there. So I'd say a little bit higher for replay value, I think.
Sure. 29 out of 117 people say this requires a previous story. Don't listen to this as your first Davros story.
No, God,
I
no,
don't
no,
know
no,
why
no, no,
anyone would.
no.
There's no way that anyone is going, this Doctor Who thing. I should start watching this. Seems like it'd be right up my alley. Where should I start? The
No,
Davros audio story. That's where I'll
no,
begin.
no. You need at least Genesis to get
Yeah,
a decent
Genesis at a minimum.
understanding. Yeah,
But I would actually argue that what's the Peter Davison
Resurrection.
Resurrection is also pretty necessary because that builds
Oh
upon
yeah,
the Doctor Davros relationship to get to this point.
yeah,
Because like if you go into this immediately after Genesis, they've only met once, and there's not that much history between the two. I think
yeah,
Resurrection did a great
sure.
job of building that out a little bit more. So by the time you get to here, there's because I think one of the and we might as well start our discussion here. But one of the great things I think about this story is the bitter respect that the Doctor and Davros have for each other.
Mm,
Like they're
mm,
both their ideologies contrast each other so significantly to the point where they can't not despise each other, but they
mm.
both have to acknowledge the genius that the other has.
Yeah,
And
for
Davros does
sure.
it several times in the story where it's like he straight
Yeah,
up says, "Don't underestimate this man."
yeah.
And I don't think he ever once lies to the Baineses about the Doctor's capabilities either.
No, not at once. Well, and with the need to sort of watch Resurrection, I am actually surprised how well
Mm,
um this sort of conveys the elements of that story without like literally retreading the whole thing.
yeah.
Because the most important, just in terms of plot thing that crops up in this story is the fact that Davros was imprisoned for 90 years, and there's a brief, almost comedic reference in Resurrection when he says, 90 years I was in that, 90 years of mind-numbing boredom. But they expound
Oh,
on that. Sorry?
yeah. Sorry, I'm just remembering the moment you're referring to here with Davros explaining his 90 years of suspended animation and how he experienced it. And, like, that is one of the best monologues I've ever heard from Doctor Who ever.
Yeah, that monologue. Wow, that was
So powerful.
yeah. It was really well, it's horrifying.
Yeah, of course.
For a start. I mean, like, okay, I don't know if I've mentioned this on the podcast before. Maybe I have, but
Mhm.
I personally have hallucinated. It was the worst experience I've ever been through. And so I very much related to how Davros described the fact that his phantoms of his past, present, and future started to rise up from the depths of his subconscious to torment him.
Mhm.
Um, and even things like when he said that, I didn't feel my heart beating, and then I felt my heart beating, and that was the
Mhm.
first second.
Yeah.
That
Oh, he
also,
describes like he describes what feels like decades and decades and thousands of years of self-reflection, and then he feels his heartbeat and realizes he's only been there for a second. That moment, like that, chilled me to my core.
yeah, it's
There's not a lot
horrifying.
that can make me feel sympathy for a despicable character like Davros, but that, Jesus Christ.
Yeah, you really feel a deep sense of sympathy for him and that
Yeah.
suffering. Um, Actually reminds me of another thing that Davros said in Resurrection when he's describing his imprisonment. He said, they call it being humane,
Mm.
and yeah,
Nope.
it nope, it fucking
Absolutely
isn't.
not.
Really horrifying, and the fact that, and this is another, I think, element that I think the story does very, very well, is it really, I think, explores Davros's psychology in such a
100%, yeah.
way that we we hold no illusions about who this person is, what
Oh, yeah.
he's capable of, what he does, but we really feel for him. And I think, the fact that I think that what the story shows is something that I've certainly believed about Davros, and I think is quite clear from the beginning. A lot of who he is, I think, is due to the horrible, war obsessed fascist society that he grew up in.
Yep.
He was taught to hate others, and he was, in a lot of ways, taught to hate himself. Um, because when he's, after he's in the explosion and he becomes hooked up to all these machines, the Khalids basically, and they show this in flashback, the Khalids just basically think that he should kill himself. Um, there's a line here, which hopefully I'll be able to find it. Um, but they say like that in Khalid society, they had core principles like self-reliance, um, and genetic purity, and I'm like, Jesus fucking Christ, that's
Yep.
repulsive.
Well,
Um,
yeah, it's incredible, isn't it, that every
hmm,
time this story starts to make you feel like a twinge of empathy for Davros. Um, every single time it does that, it then pivots and it has Davros either learning the wrong thing or like just reverting back to his core nature, right?
hmm.
Because
Yeah,
there's the
hmm,
right because the end of the monologue where he's like, uh, that whole feeling my heartbeat and going through
hmm,
all this and how torturous it was. But then he gets to the end of it and he's like, oh no, it puts me above the gods or whatever he said,
hmm,
to that effect. And then there's the backstory stuff, which is really powerful, where like
for sure.
it starts to hint that he might have actually felt something for someone else with the character of Sean, who will come
Yeah.
more to a bit later on.
Hmm,
And it starts to explore that, and you're like, from the first few hints of flashback, you think, oh, maybe she was like someone who brought this element out of him, whereas like that small element of caring for someone else, and then it later pivots to, oh no, he was just as manipulative and horrible to her,
hmm.
but for are the more sadistic and tormented reasons.
Um,
And it's just
yeah.
fascinating that like
Hmm.
because this could have easily just been a story where it's like we know that Davros is despicable and we're not going to apologize for that, but we are going to show you how he became that way and like start him on like a sympathetic route, which leads to like
Hmm.
the corruption of Davros. But
Hmm.
instead, it like sort of doubles down. It's like no, he's just always been this way.
Well, it's an interesting thing because I think ultimately what this story is thematically, is a tragedy because
Mm,
feel sorry for Davros, not just because of, the horrible suffering that he's been through, but that he is the way he is because he was raised in an institution that taught him these really, really despicable morals, and his
yep,
whole, I think, his dramatic arc really, is him wrestling with these influences and trying to transcend them, and he can't break free from these horrific um fascist
yeah,
but they're not no, they're not instincts. They're ideas. They're ideas that have been given to him by the
yeah.
society he was in. He just can't escape it. The opening monologue to this story. I mean, my
It's
God.
it sets the
Uh,
spirit incredibly well
okay.
for me off.
So I'll give a slight backstory and a personal anecdote to this. So I listened to this story years ago because it came with the Davros collection.
Yeah,
There was a whole bunch of Big Finish audio stories, including this, the Juggernauts, all of I Davros, which is another very good series of stories, and something called the Davros Mission, which I think is kind of like a slight prequel to this story. Anyway, so it came with this story, and I listened to it, and just like for me personally, being a chronically ill child, there was something. Obviously, I could sense the darkness, but there was something weirdly empowering about that speech. It's the fact that Davros, he refuses to, um,
whatever.
like to give up. Yeah,
Yeah,
like he, it's him sort of. He's even sort of in that moment wrestling with the sort of the fascist mentality of his society because again he says they expect me to kill myself. Well, I'm not going to do that. Fuck that shit. You know,
yeah,
I'm gonna keep going. This is not the end. This is only the beginning. And there's something very stirring about that. But the brilliance I think of it, and this is why it sort of works thematically, is even in that speech, it may not be like super clear, but if you go back and sort of look at it and examine it, the fascism is still there just in perhaps not as hugely overt ways. So he says, they have them with their perfect strong bodies. They fear me. Um, well, all bodies are perfect, Davros. Like it's not some nasty, disgusting competition. There's no. Do you know what I mean? Like, yeah,
yeah, definitely, yeah. Well, it's
like
that
it.
kind of thing that comes up, and it's come up before with when we've been talking about these kinds of characters, the us versus them, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And
He can't.
there's a big section towards like the about the 3/4 mark when the Davros is talking about this with Lorraine. You
Mm,
know, he talks about Khaled versus Thal, Neanderthal versus Homo sapien,
yeah,
and how like there's the instinct of every time people will betray, it's the us versus them, which he believes in to his core because of a lot of this upbringing that he's had,
yeah,
and
yeah,
that is, I think, the main thesis of Davros as a character.
for sure. And
It's that mentality of it's if it's not me, it's them, or if it's not them, it's
yeah,
me,
yeah,
and that drives Davros to every level of his being, and
mm,
every time he's proven wrong. Particularly in this story, and I think it's so powerful that his undoing in this is someone being just uh, like eternally selfless
mm,
when Kim uh, uses Davros's poison thing
mm,
on herself to
yeah,
make the doctor's decision easier to not let Davros escape.
yeah,
Like that is the ultimate sacrifice play, and it is the ultimate uh, rejection of us versus them, where someone
yeah,
gives themselves up for the greater
for
good.
sure, for sure. Um, But I think, like as I say, the like that line of the perfect strong bodies again, it underlies the tragedy,
Mm.
because like I think Davros to a considerable extent hates himself, but it's sad that he's been taught to hate himself. He's been taught to think, oh, I'm yeah, I think he describes himself and he says, they think, that I'm crippled, so I guess I have to hate myself now. And God, that's so sad.
Yeah.
That's really, really sad that he's been given and internalized this really despicable narrative.
Yeah.
And he can't reconcile any of this stuff. He will never, unless he's able to sort of transcend his fascist upbringing, he'll never be able to embrace or accept himself. And it's really tragic that he can't do that. Again, they answer that question in the story in the negative. The I think the grip that the what I don't think it's an exaggeration to call the fascist mind virus. The
Yeah.
grip that it has over his being and his belief system is has been so ingrained by this point. Not to mention the fact that he's probably losing quite a bit of his sanity at this point because he's been locked up in a prison for 90 years.
Well,
That
yeah,
it's
of
all
course.
culminating together in this really tragic end that, only ends in destruction. And he basically says that. He says that, he literally says to the doctor, there's no such thing as too much destruction. And I actually love that line because if that line was in Destiny, I would have fucking hated it. I would have thought, what the fuck are you doing? That is so stupid. That is so childish. That is so one-dimensional. Get it out of here. But because it's in the context of this story, because we've seen the flashbacks, and we have a really good picture of the just this really meaty, seething internal conflict that's just raging inside Davros, even if he can't acknowledge it or even be aware of it. That line is actually really brilliant and just as chilling as it sounds. So, uh, anyway, yes, the point is the psychological depth to Davros, I think, is the biggest win here. Um, and it's admirable that we're able to feel the way we do about Davros. That again, we pity him, we empathize with him, and sympathize with him. In again, because of the terrible way he's raised, the fact that he can't, yeah, fuck it. I don't care if this sounds sentimental. He doesn't know how to practice self love. I know that sounds no, genuinely. That's what the issue is. He can't. He hates himself
Yeah.
because he's unfortunately been taught to hate himself, and it's so sad. So when you put all this together, you have such a wonderful resource of
Yeah.
psychological depth and richness, and it's just, oh god, it's great. Listening to it, it's just fantastic.
Yeah, and I really enjoy how a lot of this story it gives a lot of flashbacks to pre-Genesis Davros, and I
Yes.
really like that it doesn't do those chronologically either. Like it
Yeah,
really
no,
jumps
that's
around. Like it
important.
starts out by generally going from when his surgery is done to like backwards in time, but
Yeah,
then it starts to jump around a little bit. We hear him giving a speech about how Thal sympathizers have been found within the council, and
yeah,
they'll be dealt with, and there'll be a new council forming for the good of all Carlads. And then we learn through his dynamic with Sean how that actually happened, and how that entire thing was just a way to undermine a relationship that she had because he can't wrestle with the fact that he might have feelings for her and therefore went after someone he cares. It's like a very incel move.
well, yeah, it's very
But
interesting.
and
I say, go ahead.
well, it's just fascinating that like he continuously denies that side of himself as well. He
Oh yeah, he says I don't feel anything. Well, that's a
well,
fucking
yeah,
lie.
well, yeah, he clearly does.
Yeah,
But there's something to that I think where it's like he sees himself above it all, so he can't be bothered to muck in with what people should be feeling. Like he can't even acknowledge, even though he clearly like thinks back on her wistfully, despite all the fucking awful shit he does to her.
hmm.
Like he does think wistfully on Shan, and I don't
Yeah.
think we hear in this story what happens to her in the end. Oh no, she gets blown up by the the mines, right? In the accident that injured Davros. Is that what happened?
Yes, I think so.
Yeah.
Well, that's interesting because all the groundwork for this backstory that they're laying would be
Yeah.
expanded on in Davros, and I'm actually surprised because this came out 3 years before Davros did. But I'm
Yeah.
surprised how cohesive the world building is from one story to the other. Like you could listen to this after Davros, and it would fit perfectly. I think.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. That
Um,
makes sense.
it's and it really it's interesting. This is, I think, in some ways, I'm tempted to say maybe the thematically darkest story we've looked at so far. Um, I think maybe Genesis might be a fairly close second, but still,
Maybe like they're both very much like two pieces of the same puzzle.
that's true. It's all about that sort of Skaro world building.
Yeah.
But I think it's just funny, I guess, that it would get much darker in Davros. Like look, I
Lust.
know I've talked about this
Foreboding.
before.
Yeah.
I know I've made reference to it, and I will be very interested to see because I do want to cover that story at some point. But
I'm sure we'll get there eventually. Like this listening to this has definitely given me a bit of a big finish itch.
yeah, because Davros is great. And all these themes that we're talking about now, they expand on them even more. Um, but Davros is maybe. I mean, I haven't watched a lot of Torchwood, so maybe it would be different, but certainly in terms of like, yeah, non-Torchwood stuff, it is definitely, I think, that the darkest, thematically and even in terms of content, the darkest story, certainly that I've come across in the Doctor Whoniverse.
Sure.
Maybe, that's true just objectively, because man, yeah, there's a lot of stuff in that story, and honestly, I mean, I enjoyed it when I first listened to it because I listened to it at the same time as I listened to this because I got the Davros collection, so of course I had to go through most of it. Um, but I'm astonished Davros didn't fuck me up even more than it did when I listened to it as a kid because there is wild stuff in that story. Like,
Look, when you've made the cell stop selling.
yeah, it's I know I've said this before, but genuinely, I've listened to death metal songs that aren't as disturbing as Davros is. So
Okay.
there's that.
Sure.
Um,
Well, speaking on the themings, but I think we can move on to was it TIA? TAI?
yes,
TAI, TAI.
TAI. Actually, just one thing before we do that I do
Yeah.
want to touch on. You talked about Davros and his incel mentality. I mean, yeah. But
Well,
the
yeah.
curious thing is, there's a similarity, I think, maybe not exactly the same, but a similarity between the relationship between Davros and Shan and Mr. Joe Bell and Tassenbeaker. For again, there's differences, but there's kind of a
Cool.
similar nasty dynamic.
Yeah.
And it's interesting that this is what I talked about before when I said that even the themes that don't get a huge focus, they still feel really satisfying because they are sort of questioning um really the sort of toxic masculinity that Davros has succumbed to.
Yeah, I
And the
hadn't thought
fact
of
that
that.
he's like, oh well, he takes this really disgusting attitude to the worst extremes you can imagine. It's like, oh well, if I can't, have her, I'm using quotation marks there, but it's like, yeah, if I can't, have her, then nobody can. And as Sean says, he doesn't even have the psychological depth or the tools to even grapple with that's how he's feeling. He just thinks, oh, enemy, bye bye, he can't deal with it. And I actually wonder, it might be different if I go back and watch Revelation again, but I'll put this to you, Cuff. In terms of those themes, do you think that they did a better job in this story than they did in Revelation?
Um, yes, I do.
Yeah, because I think you even said one of the issues you had with, I think, with Tassin Baker in particular is that you wanted a bit more with her character. You wanted some more nuance. She wasn't, I mean, maybe not totally two-dimensional, but
No.
there was still, she was lacking a little bit in maybe that third dimension. But I think even though Shan has less, you know, um,
Time.
audio time.
Sure.
Yeah, she seems more nuanced than Tassenbeaker was.
Well,
So
yeah, but I think it's just because like Sean has like the for lack of a better term, the balls to call Davros out, whereas
oh yeah, for
Tassenbeaker
sure.
was very much just like
So,
doting and fawning and
yeah.
like
Well, similarly to Mrs. Baines, like Tassenbeaker sort of cause, like she you could kind of feel her getting sucked into sort of the cult of personality around Davros a little bit in that story. But
yeah.
Sean has sort of displays a bit more courage, is able to, as you say, combat against Davros and his bullshit a little bit
Mm,
more, which is very interesting. So there's, as you say, yeah, I think honestly this probably is it's done better. It also maybe it helps the fact that we get to care a lot more about Davros in this story, which is ironic because he's a fucking disgusting mass murderer. But I
mm.
find him way more interesting and compelling, and even more sympathetic than Mr. Jobel ever was.
Oh no, 100%. Like
So
Jesus Christ.
yeah, so for all those reasons, there, as I say, there's a similar relationship here, but I think it honestly is probably getting explored better in
Yeah,
this story and to a considerable degree. Anyway, so that's that point. But yes, Annie, let's move on to uh,
TAI, yeah.
TAI.
I
Um,
find it interesting
mm,
and look, we've held off on doing this for like 50 minutes or so in this episode so far, but I mean, it remains to be said that this story, which is by far the deepest character exploration of one of the show's most popular characters, at least most popular villains.
mm,
Um, it's so showing that this highly regarded, you know, universally almost acclaimed audio drama of a character that most of the fan base likes to watch. It's awfully political.
yeah, it's fucking weird. I mean, imagine having a story where like they show how dangerous capitalism is and how
Yeah,
the institutions of capitalism almost sort of hold society to ransom because oh,
but
if we
more
collapse, I guess then what'll be left.
But more,
Um,
but more than anything, though, and this is the fascinating part, and this is the part where I get where my shut the fuck up about the political nature of the show thing comes really into play. Davros is not a commercially minded character, and
no,
yet this capitalist story and this criticism of mega corporations and these commercial systems, but also uh, a criticism of uh, extremists' commercial terrorism.
mm,
It's amazing that none of it is out of place.
nope, it
Like
all works.
it all really fits in, and it doesn't distract from any of the Davros stuff. It
No,
doesn't take anything away from a lot of the fascism stuff that Davros has,
no, it's
and in fact, making parallels to Davros and the CEO of this big corporation. Again, not out of place. Again, it doesn't feel preachy. Again, it's not like
no,
tacked on.
no,
Funny that, right?
yeah. It's almost like these are
Hmm.
really important themes that deserve to be written with nuance.
Hmm.
Fucking weird, eh?
Yeah, and it's so weird because I could have sworn that like you would think that this because of all that political stuff, this story must have been made after 2018.
Hmm.
Because because obviously the show wasn't political until there was a woman in
Well,
the role. But
well,
like no,
well.
this was 2003.
You say that,
2003,
Cuff.
15 years. No, that can't be right.
Well, you say it like Cuff, but this couldn't have been written, in that period because this story is well written. So, you know, um, yeah.
Good
But your
point. Well
point,
made.
yeah, but your point is, yeah, it's like, why the fuck would you watch the ridiculous clownish Trump stand-in when you can just listen to this?
Yeah, certainly, Arnold Baines is no Jack Robertson.
No, no. And I'll tell you, actually, I will say something interesting about this sort of ideological, sort of variations, I suppose you see here. There's a very interesting conversation that takes place between Davros and Willis, and he's talking about how, I've got this formula that's
Hmm.
basically going to destroy the galactic economy. And then Willis says that, oh, well, what's going to happen? Are we going to, like, we should probably move to, like, a post-economic system, but it's going to take time for people to psychologically adjust to that.
Yeah.
He doesn't say it, and granted, politics and history isn't my expertise, but he almost sounds like he's trying to describe some form of communism or something. Um, but
Mm.
then the funny part is Davros then just cuts across him, and again he doesn't say the word. But what he then describes, he says, "No, we're not going to do that. We're going to do a war mentality, fascist ideology." And I do want to actually go here and read what Davros says, because I wrote it down because it was a very interesting and I think good quote. So when Willis is describing this new society, he said, "No, we're not going to do that." This is how he describes Davros's idea of a society. Davros says, "Criminals and undesirables will be put to work as laborers. Those with particular aptitude will form the elite. The citizens will provide a workforce. The women will produce and rear children. The men will work in new factories and in the armies, and all surplus production capacity will go into new armaments." So again,
Hmm.
not my area of expertise, but that sounds pretty fucking fascist to me, especially with
Yep.
this talk of an elite,
Oh
which
yeah.
it's the Scaro project all over again.
Um, sure is. But
Yeah,
also back on TAI, and
yeah,
this gave me a real chuckle when it came up. But when
mm,
uh Davros, I think, was being it was either Davros was being shown the propaganda ad, or they were describing TAI, and
yeah.
they describe it as a small grass.
Oh,
It was a grassroots family.
homegrown family owned mega
Yeah,
corporation.
homegrown family-owned mega corporation, and I love the juxtaposition of that
Yeah,
because like that's
exactly.
not a thing.
I got I wrote the quote down here, and I said, yeah, like it's so wonderfully oxymoronic. It's just, and it's a nice subtle way of sort of indicating how sort of dangerous this is. But there are other moments that sort of indicate the horrors of TAI as well. The bit where the Doctor wakes up and he finds out he's got this
Yep.
terrifying fucking robot thing in his ear,
Yeah.
and
Against his
and then
will.
sorry,
Against his will. He wasn't
against his
informed
will,
about it.
against his will, and then there's a bit where it's like. Whereas, like, oh, here are the uniforms for you to wear, Doctor. It's like, no, I think I'll stick with my own clothes, thank you. It's like, if you would like to,
Showcase
mark yourself out with
individuality.
a bit of individuality. Here are three different ties for you to wear, and I
Yeah.
love that because
Plain
it's
striped character or like
funny cartoon character or solid color. But
yeah,
I love that because that shows you know
like a cog in the
a
machine kind of
yeah,
thing. Yeah.
well, it shows one of the key flaws with capitalism, rampant capitalism in particular, and I think
Mhm.
even, I mean, I'm not going to quote him directly here, obviously, but I think even Noam Chomsky would say something like this, that it gives you the illusion of choice. Sorry, guys, yeah, there are only three corporations to choose from, and they're probably all like, and they're all like super similar to each other, but you still have a choice, right?
Yeah.
Choose which tie do you want, folks? It's so yeah, it's
But there's also there's the moment when Davros is doing his little Davros thing and whispering in everyone's ear to get what he
mm,
wants. But it's concerning the Doctor, and they're having a conversation about, we don't listen in on our employees, we don't record them, we don't like watch them, that's unethical. But then later on that same conversation he goes, oh, but we have the capabilities to do it,
yeah.
which is,
Um,
just very, very ominous and chilling.
which is and this is another a small thing, but it almost parallels the conversation between Davros and Shan when he basically
Yeah,
reveals that
yeah.
he was spying on her and her birth, which is really disturbing.
Yeah, Jesus. And
And
they allude to the fact that he had been like watching slash listening while
mm,
Sean and the Chancellor were getting
mm,
intimate, and they gloss over it, but it's like very, very disturbing that
yeah,
that's a thing that happened.
it's totally fucked. Um, but yeah, like the yeah, I don't know, yeah, like the surveillance element. Maybe they're trying to parallel that between Davros and the corporations.
They almost certainly are, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. In any case, as you say, yeah, this whole big mega corporation, they do a good job of not
Mm.
painting a good picture of it. I actually, I
But
wrote,
it's so you do your thing first, but yeah.
I wrote down something here. This is just a thought that I have. That I think this story kind of shows that monopolization is the true destiny of capital.
Yeah.
That these mega corporations like they own so much, particularly this one particular one, TAI, that again people don't have any other choice. They can't go anywhere else. They don't have any other way to find food. There's a famine going on,
Yeah.
which also incidentally kind of helps lead into the revelation, but that's a whole other thing. Anyway, yeah.
True,
So
yeah.
it's just sorry.
That's another thing I hadn't thought of, yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, it just all sort of really works together and being this wonderful
Yeah.
anti-capitalist almost like a treatise really. It's
Yeah,
kind of
which is interesting because,
great.
like, basically right from the off, the Doctor is against the whole thing, right? Like,
Yeah, for sure.
incredibly critical of, like, he sees through the propaganda immediately. He identifies that's not the reality. That's just what they want you to know, and he's very very quick to point out all of the flaws in this megacorp. Um, I do specify this megacorp because, as we all know, there is a different megacorporation that the Doctor absolutely loves. It's another, distribution megacorp. It's similar to TAI. They do very similar things. The difference is that TAI doesn't have a friendly Kablam man to be the face of the company, which must be the key difference because, as we all know, Kablam is a megacorp that the Doctor very much loves and sings its praises of and is not critical of in any way.
Remember that time that we both thought Kablam was a good episode?
Yep, and I was speaking to Sam about this the other day as well. Um, I was able to identify the reason why Kablam I liked it at the time. And we'll touch more on this when we actually review Kablam. But I remember specifically the reason that I thought Kablam was good is because it went in an unexpected route towards the end, right? Because the
Sure.
whole episode sets up like there's this CEO character that they're setting up to be the bad guy, and then it pivots and it's like, no, he's not the bad guy, it's this other person. And at the time, I remember being, oh, I didn't see that coming. That's actually like really impressive. And now looking back, I'm like, hang on, that's worse.
Yeah.
It would have
That's
been better if it was just the CEO who was the bad guy.
yeah, it's much worse. It's
Yeah.
thematically simplistic and ethically extremely disturbing. So yep, that's a thing.
Yeah, and
But
it's
yeah,
incredible that we can, like, it's the Sixth Doctor, which is also not an amazingly ethical Doctor at times.
mm,
But in this story, he has the moral high ground over the 13th Doctor. And I really hope this is paralleling the 13th Doctor's future. Like I said at
yeah,
the beginning, I really want Jodie Whittaker to get some kind of redemption in Big Finish.
yeah,
Because, like, for the love of God, they're like, if the elements of the 13th Doctor that work are given to a Doctor that is still the Doctor to their core, I think that they would make for an incredible series of Big Finish stories.
yeah. I'd totally agree. I think I mean it would definitely be true if that happens. Like if there's some new great audio stories with Jodie Whittaker in them that are well written. But it's even true today anyway that when you look at the Chibnall era, man, those stories they are gonna age like milk. Like
Yeah,
we're gonna and I know that you and I, Cuff, we've been on a bit of a journey, sort of
yeah.
getting over that sort of honeymoon phase with Chibnall and his incredibly ridiculous and bizarre creative choices. But I think the big mystery of the whole thing that we'll look back on is how we didn't notice it sooner.
Well, I
Um,
think I think there's actually like a really big psychological component to it, and it's
mm,
something that I had to work. This is actually the main thing I had to work through. Um, there was, I think, a an instinct, especially when the Jodie Whittaker era was beginning, to like it specifically to spite the sexists.
Mm.
You know what I mean?
Yeah,
There's
for
that
sure.
idea of there are some people who are going to hate this purely because of like the casting decision.
Yeah.
Therefore, I need to be above that and like
And
look
champion
past
it.
that.
Yeah.
Well, it was I think to specifically look past it, right?
Yeah,
But
for
in
sure.
doing so, in looking past that, I think people ended up looking past quite a lot of other issues that weren't
Oh, yeah.
genuine. And the
Yeah.
problem was, at times, you couldn't address those issues and say the show is bad now without being lumped in with the bad people.
Yeah.
And in fact, and it's really, really harrowing and like awful. But I saw on a comment, there was a YouTube comment a while back on, not a while back, a few weeks ago actually, on I forget where it was on. No, I think it was on something to do with the 60th anniversary or something about that.
Hmm.
Where someone was like, I'm really glad that Russell T Davies is coming back. He was a good writer. He'll make the show good again. And then someone else had replied to that going, I don't know, have you seen the new Doctor? And someone was like, hang on, what's wrong with that? Like, there's nothing wrong with casting a black actor. And then the guy responded with, so you'd be okay if a white actor took a role that was traditionally taken by a black actor? Would that be okay? I don't think so. There's this double standard here. And I remember thinking, wow, that is an impressive straw man that you've built.
Yeah,
Like that thing is
that's so
colossal.
fucking stupid.
I know there are so many things that like.
Yeah.
Well, for one thing, could you imagine like the guy saying, "Could you imagine if a white actor took a role from a black actor?" I felt like replying, "You're talking about the history of Hollywood.
Yeah, I
Like
mean,
you're just talking about acting. That has happened before." But also, like, there's nothing like this casting Kuchiri Gadwa doesn't contradict anything that we've seen in the show before this point. It doesn't
nope.
contradict how regeneration works. We've seen racial swaps between regenerations in the past. Like, fucking get over it. I just
Yeah.
can't believe people still have this
Yeah.
fucking bizarre mentality where it's, and again, it's coming back to the us versus them, right? It's seeing
Yeah.
it's seeing not a white actor in the role that has traditionally been held by a white actor and seeing that and instantly going, this must be a war on white people.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
where it comes from. It's, and like in that sense, this story, like I know we're not specifically talking about Davros at this moment, but that element of the story, whereas the Chibnall era is going to age like milk, this thing it's aging like champagne.
Mm. It's yeah, it's disturbing to have to reckon with the nastier attitudes that are still somehow fucking present. But you know, I'm not sure how to ultimately deal with that problem.
I know, and I as
But
much as I wanted to comment that stuff, I didn't because I
yeah,
knew that like, well, I'm gonna type that, and he's either not going to respond or he's going to bite back with something that's equally misguided, and like, there's not going to be any like educating, at least not in one YouTube comment.
no,
There's
no, no,
not
no,
going to
no,
be any
no,
educating
no,
those
no,
people.
no,
Like, it's not the forum for it.
no. To be sure. Um, yeah,
But CAI, the
yeah,
it's interesting that the impetus for getting the Doctor into the story is this idea of they're closing all the mines and they're going to put 12 billion people out of work.
Hmm.
And that whole thing ended up being like a no, no, we
that
won't. We're
was
not going to do that.
that was
And it
just
was,
a funny, goofy little prank, guys.
well, yeah, that was the one thing where I was like, okay, like so that was like it was basically just the reason to get the Doctor involved in the story, and the
Hmm.
fact that they a dropped it for like an hour and a half, and then
Hmm.
B when they addressed it again, they were just like, oh no, we weren't going to do that. That was just like an idea.
Yeah,
And it was like, oh, okay. That
hmm.
did feel a bit weak to me because it was just like
Sure,
they clearly wanted a
sure.
reason to get the Doctor involved, and it didn't really like factor
Yeah,
in too much after that.
yeah. That element is admittedly certainly not as strong as the rest of the storytelling. Um,
Yeah,
I
certainly.
hadn't thought about it that much, or I think it was sort of swirling around in my subconscious. But I think,
Mhm.
yeah, some of the sort of flaws that might stop this from being like a perfect story again. Not that that really exists, but you know what I mean. Like it's
Yeah.
not it's not terrible. It certainly doesn't ruin
No.
any part of the
Yeah.
story, but it's you just listen to them like you just wish could they have done something better there.
Yeah. Like
Um,
if they were maybe
hmm,
if they were like being like sent into like rather than like stop 10, 12 billion people from losing their jobs, if they'd been sent into like maybe there was some like someone had found something shady concerning the robots that were being manufactured, which
hmm,
does end up being some like kind of a factor in the story because
yeah,
they are hiding stuff regarding the robots and what their purpose is and what they're for,
mm,
and then the robots end up being part of the resolution as well.
yeah,
That maybe that would have tied it in just a little bit tighter.
mm, yeah, yeah. I mean, they could have done something about that. I mean,
It's a small part overall. It's not nothing
yeah,
major.
yeah. Like, well, you wonder,
Scrap.
like, was there any implication that all the 12 million people that were going to lose their jobs that they would lose it to automation? Because if there wasn't, they could have worked it in that way because there's obviously
Maybe.
robots on this planet.
Yeah.
So
I mean, if that is what it was, it wasn't like a huge. It wasn't big enough of a focus for me to understand that as an element of
no, 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 no
political, political. Uh, what's the word I'm looking for?
commentary.
Commentary that they were going for.
Yeah.
Um.
Yeah, yeah, which is and it's fine because the rest of
Yeah.
the whole anti-capitalist thing that they're going with it's
Oh yeah.
executed
Like it's
beautifully
clear
enough to
enough. It's clear enough from just
mm,
the stuff that we get there. I also
for
just
sure.
love the and it's another small moment, but it's the interview that Baines has with Willis.
Yeah, yeah.
Um.
Oh, that was great.
Yeah, the fact that it gets so like genuinely sinister and
Mm,
creepy. But it again, that's another thing that parallels Davros. Like we see in that from that conversation that Baines is using very similar techniques and tactics that Davros used and has and is using. You know, like the
yeah.
overt threatening and the the
Mm,
faux friendship status. You know, like I'll stay, please. You know, you've got more
yeah.
uh
You've got more access than most people,
who work here. Yeah,
yeah. Um
it's
and yeah, and if you he basically says like, um if you're like a prisoner, then that must be true for the majority of the population of the galaxy.
and then
And
that
it's
just
such a great
they just let that sit. They don't
yeah,
address
and
that.
they
They just let that
and
moment
it's
hang
just
there for a bit, and it's so good.
yeah, it's genuinely great dialogue. It's very subtle, and it works. Again, it's just it's a show don't tell thing, right? Like it's really
Yeah,
just
definitely.
displaying it's him we can see the subtext and it's really effective and it's really effective because it's subtext because it's so sort of clandestine because he's trying to give a kind of corporate sheen to this overt threat
Mm.
which let's be clear that's exactly what it is. um
I just find it
it's
so compelling and fascinating that Baines has
mm,
some moral code.
mm,
You know, like it's small, but we see him like through. Well, we don't see him. I should probably stop using that phrase. But we hear him a couple of times throughout the story be like, "We wouldn't do that as a corporation. That's morally wrong. That's unethical." But then,
yeah,
like the first thing that we experience of these characters in the story is A, being Davros sympathizers, and B, killing a crew of pilots in cold blood.
yeah, yeah,
But then, like he's okay with murder, but then like corporate espionage is where he draws the line,
yeah, it's
which is just fascinating. Like he's not willing to do
mm,
anything that will tank the company itself,
yeah,
but if there's something that's morally wrong that leads to the betterment of his company, that no
mm,
one that is off the record of the company's books, he's perfectly happy to cross any
yeah,
lines
for
there.
sure, for
And
sure.
I just found that just they that's just a really interesting kind of CEO character.
Yeah, because again, and we've probably mentioned this before with other stories, but it's very easy to make, that sort of character, the clownish, almost
Mm.
Trump-like figure.
Yeah,
Um, but and don't get me wrong, they make it very clear who this guy is and where his interests lie, but there is room for those sorts of nuances there. Um, Yeah, it's
especially with
very
like,
interesting.
and I want to like drift the conversation onto Lorraine Baines
Yeah,
now.
yeah, sure.
Uh, she has like quite an arc in this. She starts out as a Davros sympathizer, as I said,
Yeah,
and it's sort of ambiguous, like whether or not she like believes in his mentalities at the beginning. She definitely rejects them later in the story.
yeah,
But like at the start, it's just like she has a big focus on the intellect of Davros,
yeah,
and
and
she
the
and
scientific progress and
yeah,
whatnot.
and as a result, she's like either ignoring or justifying many of the atrocities he created,
Yep, for
which I
sure.
mean, like again, is something that is still ever present in our society, which is just
Hmm.
fucking sad.
Yeah,
But I think that Lorraine, throughout the story, she was just kind of like, okay, this is a good character, but I've kind of it's a character I've seen before.
mm,
It's not that like it's thematically rich, but there's certainly elements that are richer. But then it gets to that final conversation between
mm,
her and the doctor.
mm,
She has the company now.
yeah,
Um, and then like almost like a flick of a switch, she goes from being this character where I was like, okay, you've been through your growth, you've had your arc, and then instantly she's back to corporate minded, and
yeah,
you know she's instantly like, well, we haven't done anything wrong.
yeah.
You
And
show
there's
me
no
the
evidence
record
of
of
it.
yeah, you show me the record of us hiring Davros. You do that now. But like, it's so fascinating. Like 5 seconds beforehand, she was like literally the tone of her voice changed. Like actually, like the
Yeah, yeah,
pitch of the voice,
yeah,
it physically changed,
yeah,
and
for
she
sure.
instantly got threatening, and like she instantly became like her husband.
Yeah, she went from fear to full on business mode because
Yeah, and it's
because
so fascinating that the episode
mm,
is willing to show how quickly that semblance of corporate power instantly corrupts.
yeah, I think and in a way it makes sense that she went from like pure fear to this this capitalist instinct, I suppose,
Yeah.
because that in itself shows how scared she is, because this her business person face,
Mm.
that's her coping mechanism.
Yeah.
That's the only way she's learned from her, probably I assume her learned from her husband to survive,
Mm.
which is to be ruthless in this corporate world. um and as you say, having those psychological depths is very interesting, and kind of really similarly to Davros. She can't reconcile these things. She doesn't
Yeah.
have the psychological tools to really unpack all of this, and it's really good to show that. Um, and this also kind of um so it brings me back a little bit to something I said earlier in terms of the sort of institutional impacts. Yeah, and this is another line I'll bring in too. It's when Kim is talking to, I think she's talking to Willis about some sort of food dispenser, and she says this dispenser is top of the range and can synthesize over 1,000. And then she realizes that she's just
Yep.
sort of bought into the propaganda machine. But
And
I
that's
think,
right after Willis has been like, I know that like you guys can think for yourselves, but the amount of times you hear this stuff, it does have some kind
yeah,
of subconscious effect, and you just become part of the propaganda and
yeah,
advertising
for
machine.
sure. And it goes back to also to when he says to Willis, are you responding to what the people want, or are you telling them what they want?
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
anyway, but the overall point for me is with all of this stuff, it shows that I think the real evil are these institutions, whether it's capitalism or fascism, and the horrible effect they have on people on an individual scale and on a larger scale.
Mm.
That it can that people can be indoctrinated like that. It's really
Mm.
disturbing.
And also,
And
well, to that effect as well, and something that it's an element of the story we haven't quite touched on yet. I mean,
mm,
we did a little bit, um, but it's the way that the Doctor and Davros interact
sure.
for a lot of this story.
Mm,
For the first half at least, they're together quite a bit. They're
mm,
uh, sort of unlikely workmates, both working for this big corporation for a little bit, trying to like help them. Well, the Doctor's there to make sure Davros can't do anything bad, but um, as a result, they're both like furthering progress in a weird way.
Mm.
But and again, like it's another thing that you talked on with the Doctor, like Davros rather, constantly being reinforced that to look past any self love he might give himself, and they're like, especially after the big I felt my heartbeat thing.
Mm.
Um, and again, something Davros says quite a lot in the story. It's like I thought I could change
Mm.
as well, and you got to
Mm.
wonder like if the Doctor hadn't constantly reinforced he's evil, you can't change Davros.
Yeah.
Is there a chance that he might have been able to?
That is a very, very good point, actually. And interestingly, near the end, because there's an implication that he's almost hallucinating because he thinks that
Mm,
his technology's malfunctioning. He's getting sort of trapped in his own flashbacks, and he's seeing the Doctor in his
yeah,
flashbacks. But the way the Doctor's talking to Davros is really cruel and mean and nasty. And I wrote down that I think that's a reflection of how Davros actually feels about himself, because obviously it's his subconscious.
yep,
But as you kind of say, when you compare it to what the Doctor actually says,
yep.
is it that different? Because the
Well,
Doctor is like, I mean, and maybe it's just a symptom of the fact that this is Colin Baker's Doctor. Because I wonder how
mm,
easily other doctors would rush to these sorts of comments. But I think I don't know if I've written it down, but there's a bit where um when he first sees Davros, he says something like, "Look at him, he even looks evil," and I'm like, "Fuck you, man!"
I mean, to
Like,
that end, like to that effect, rather, the Sixth Doctor was the perfect Doctor for this story because
yes,
that's what that the reinforcement of these self views. That's what this story is all about with Davros. It's about can he rise past his own internal programming, or will he succumb to it?
yeah,
And it's entirely possible that if you put another Doctor in that situation, they might have tried to like look past and go, maybe he's planning something, or maybe he is genuinely trying to do better. I
yeah,
don't know, but the fact that the sixth Doctor has that stubborn nature.
mm.
It's
I
sort of
mean,
that reinforcement, and it's another element to the tragedy where it's like maybe
absolutely.
if in another time, in another place with another Doctor, Davros might have turned out a bit different.
He says, I consider you a friend, and it's like, we're not friends, Davros. And then he says, no, but perhaps in some other world we might have been.
Yeah,
Um, it's very, very interesting. It's about, I don't know, like the choices we make, I suppose. Like I said, this is such a thematically rich
I
story.
know,
I fucking
and
love it.
yeah, and the amount of parallels that they draw to each other over the story
Mm.
as well. The fact that they
Yeah.
specifically set up that the way that I don't know if I can't remember if they did it on TV at any point, but
Mm.
the way that they set up that Davros got disfigured as he did because of a nuclear explosion, and then
Mm.
later on in the same story they have the Doctor survive a nuclear blast as well.
Yeah.
Um, just adding those extra mirroring layers, and they did all of that without at any point saying to the Doctor, "You are a good Dalek," which is
Mm.
overused. I know it was 2003 and hadn't been done yet, but
But still.
on TV that line is overused.
Yeah.
But they did it here perfectly
Mm.
well,
Yeah.
setting up the parallels between the two. Right from the start, really, really early on, Davros calls the Doctor his equal,
Yeah.
which is something else that's fascinating about the character, which is that's something he's like really striving for
Mm.
is an equal. Like he keeps lamenting throughout the entire story that he doesn't have one.
Mm.
And he keeps recalling back to Sean at that point, which I think is because she was the only one that ever stood up to him and
For
challenged
sure.
him in that kind of way. And now the Doctor's come back to fill that role. Oh, there's
Mm.
just so much here.
Yeah, there's a lot. So many layers.
Yeah,
Uh,
it's really great.
it's like, an ogre. So sorry, I had to, I had
That's
to.
right.
Anyway, I want to bring up one. This is a smaller thing, but and this shows again why I think Colin Baker's Doctor is written as well as he is here. But it's in the beginning when both Davros and the Doctor are working on that weird little piece of technology, and he fucks it up, and he just says, "Oh dear, back to square one. Two and a
Yeah,
half hours wasted." And
yeah, it's
no,
so good.
but the reason why it really works is because there's clearly a point to it. It's not like when the Sixth Doctor was being a dickhead in the TV stories where they were just doing it to make him a
No
bit
reason.
edgy. Here, there's more.
There's a
There's
purpose
so many
to it.
more layers. It's about the psychological power game he's playing with
Yep.
Davros. It foreshadows how much he's going to be,
The mistrust as well.
and working against Davros. And also just the practically, it's like, yeah, Davros is obviously building a technology he's probably going to use for himself or going to use for this mega corporation. We're not going to have any of that. So, and again, these are small things, but they very much matter, I think, and they
Yeah.
speak to the level of depth that we're working with, which is really really exciting, I think.
And it's also something I think we're getting closer to the end of this discussion, but it's something
Yeah,
I want to
sure.
highlight about I think the way that Big Finish, at least from the evidence I've received from this 2.5 hour story, the idea that they can afford to really focus on the dialogue. They
Yeah,
can't
yeah,
afford not
yeah.
to because, of course, it is just only audio.
Yeah.
But like, you can definitely like, because in TV, there's there's other things that you have to engage the senses besides dialogue.
Yeah,
You
yeah,
know, you
for
have
sure.
the visuals, you have spectacle, you have music, all that kind of stuff,
Mm.
and very little of that is in this audio drama. There's a bit of music here and there, and it really heightens it when it is used. But there is really only the dialogue, and I'm really
Mm.
happy that they really funneled a lot into the
Mm.
dialogue in this. Um, like I said, there's so much thematic richness. Every line has a purpose. Every
Mm.
exchange has meaning. Uh, to the point where, like, even the smaller ones, like you mentioned, the one between Willis and Kim,
Mm.
which I'd forgotten before you brought it up, but even that one introduced layers on these characters and
Yeah, for sure.
themes to the story about how you know, even for that one scene, just this theme of how advertising affects us without us knowing it.
Yeah.
And that's just like a scene, one like 2 3 minute scene
Mm.
in a 2.5 hour story that introduces a theme that doesn't really get brought up for the rest of it, and yet fits in so well
Yeah,
with everything else that the
for
story
sure.
has to offer.
For sure. Yeah, it's really I do think this story is a masterclass in a lot of things, but theme is probably one of its better elements, and the way
Yeah,
it
and
how to incorporate theme
mm,
basically fit perfectly into the plot, which is very exciting. I want to highlight a small thing about Mrs. Baines here. When,
oh yeah,
like, you say that she in the end she realizes how awful Davros is and how sort of
yeah,
maniacal and authoritarian
twisted,
his mindset is, but
sadistic.
the funny thing is, like, at the beginning, I think you even said that you sense that her sense of admiration is like an academic one. It's like, oh yeah, no, he was a smart guy. He was just misunderstood in his time, and he did a lot of great
He can't be
things.
held responsible for the thousands of years that the Daleks did stuff while he wasn't there. His
Yeah.
creations went rogue on him.
Well, actually, that's another thing. I mean, maybe it's because I saw the movie, but it almost reminds me of Oppenheimer.
Oh, true, yeah.
Um, And in a way, but that certainly the movie, as far as I can tell, that says a similar thing to here too, which is that um the one of the bigger bad guys in these sort of scenarios, obviously individual people uh are important, but certainly in Oppenheimer, the institutions are like the real bad thing. In the movie Oppenheimer, you see how terrible the sort of American military industrial complex was and how it led to the use of the bombs. And anyway,
Yeah, yeah.
anyway, the point is, like, getting back to Mrs. Baines. So in the beginning, yeah, it's like it's all kind of admiration. You think, okay, obviously this is bad, but maybe she's just ignorant, but then later on, she really just gives in to the cult of personality because she says to Davros, "It's your destiny to rule, Davros. It always was." And I'm like,
Yeah.
mm, uh,
Hmm.
that doesn't sound that doesn't sound terribly above board, does it? That's a little
Not at all, yeah.
little off. That sounds highly disturbing, I think, is actually a more
Yeah.
accurate way of describing it.
Yeah. And I mean, yeah, that's definitely awful. One last thing I
Mm,
want to bring up is I
sure, sure.
mentioned at the top of the thing that like the Daleks aren't absent from the story, but they are like they're not present, but they aren't absent because like
Yeah.
they do crop up every now and then, and it's largely in world building stuff. Like there's this idea of the Dalek Wars,
Yeah.
which aren't really discussed. But there's this little element of world building I quite like, where it was I think Willis's grandfather, I think, had a platoon that took down a Dalek, and it took like
Mm.
all of their efforts, and they sort of kept little bits of Dalekanium as
Mm.
mementos. I thought, oh yeah, that's absolutely what would happen.
Oh
That's
yeah. No,
and
of course it is. Of course
yeah,
it is.
war memorabilia is absolutely a thing.
Yeah.
But like, but then, and I think this is where they really come into the forefront of the complexity of the thematic nature. When Davros is giving his CEO speech
Mm.
recording,
Mm.
and he's talking to all the different I forget what he calls them, the branch leaders or whatever. So it's something to that effect. Um,
Yeah, he called them the regional managers, which is
Yeah, yeah.
interesting.
Yep. But he goes to that speech about there's going to be a new economic system coming
Mm.
in. We need to make sure we're taking advantage. Um, you know, any non GAI products, we need to make sure they're disposed of. And then he says, exterminate the competition.
Mm.
And in that moment, you're like, oh, yep, this is still the guy who made the Daleks.
Yeah.
He's still just as awful as he was back then. And in that moment, you're like, oh, I forgot about the Daleks.
Yeah.
He says exterminate, and you're like, oh shit, yeah. Those things that are like incredibly important to this entire universe. I haven't been
Mm.
thinking about them this entire time, even though Davros is at the center of this story. That's how
Mm.
good this is.
Yeah, for sure. Absolutely. Um, yeah, I think again it just speaks to sort of how well constructed it is, how thematically rich, and how again there's almost like a I don't know, with that line, it almost seems like a joke. It's like, see guys, we can do stuff without the Daleks.
Mm.
But yeah, see, you totally forgot about them because we're that good. It's I don't know.
Yeah, but
This
even that has a purpose to it beyond that, you know.
yeah, yeah. Oh, for sure.
Not just like paying lip service to the fact
No,
that the
no, no,
Daleks
no,
exist.
no. It helps greatly with Davros's character.
Yeah, definitely.
It helps greatly with Davros's characterization and reminds us that not only do the Daleks exist, but he created them, and more importantly, infused them with all of the worst elements of his personality.
Yep.
I do not doubt for a second. I mean, I don't think it's expanded on in Genesis, but I don't doubt for a second. But that catchphrase of "exterminate" was something that Davros came up with, and the
Yeah,
Daleks just kind of
absolutely.
stuck
Yeah.
with it. So yeah, it's
I mean, I think we've praised this about as much as we're going to.
I think so. I want to bring up another thing in terms of something I noticed with the flaws, and again, this could have just be a me thing, but there was some details that I felt slightly unclear about. In
Right.
particular, like the Doctor makes reference to the fact that all the robots are now sort of helping to sort of protect the people in the dome
Citizens.
from
Yeah.
from the nuclear waste and stuff.
Hmm.
I don't remember the moment he actually did that. I just remember him saying he did that. But again, maybe that's just me. Maybe I wasn't
Yeah, I think
paying attention. But
I think that was from memory. It was while he was tinkering with the computer in the computer room. He said it was going to be
in
programmed.
the control room, yeah.
He's strong. Yeah, I can't
Okay,
remember if it
yeah.
was the same time he started kicking the computer, which was also quite funny.
I think it was
Um,
before that, but yes, that's what
yeah,
you mean. Yeah, okay, no, that makes sense. Um, yeah, okay, well, yeah, that's that cleared up.
I mean, I could be wrong, but I think I remember him saying he was
Hmm,
going to do something with them then.
right, okay.
Yeah,
Um, I guess that makes guess that all makes sense. Um, yeah, I mean, I've got a lot of notes written here, but I think we've basically covered everything that we've wanted to
sure.
say. Yeah, I think we're good.
What are you going to give this story?
I think I think I am gonna go with a 10 for this one.
Ooh,
I know that's big,
I know it's
but
big. You've only given out one of those before.
yes, I think again, look, I don't know, maybe it's possible in the future I'll regret doing that, but I there's just something in my gut that tells me I won't because I think as you said, there's tiny, tiny little flaws with some of the stuff, like the whole, oh yeah, don't worry guys, we weren't really gonna sack all these people. That doesn't really get expanded upon. But that's not really enough to sort of bring it down even like a point for me. Like there's so much here that's being done so well.
Yeah.
I can't help but sort of succumbing to how great it was. And like I said, I know like when I first listened to it this week, I'm like, yeah, I'm feeling the word masterpiece creeping up here. But I obviously wanted to listen to it again just to be absolutely sure. Um, but you know, it's pretty damn fucking good. I'm not gonna lie. I think this is one of the best stories certainly one of the best stories that we've looked at so far.
Oh yeah.
In the whole, you know, Whoniverse. So I
Yes.
think um certainly in comparison, I think it would make sense that I'd give it a 10.
Sure.
But like as a comparison, right? You know, we both loved Genesis, but
Yeah, we did.
we were both able to acknowledge some of the flaws, particularly with the plot, that there were these weird meandering moments that didn't really come together. There was even some continuity issues that didn't make a lot of sense. Still brilliant and
Yeah.
fantastic, and certainly none of that was enough to
Not at all. Yeah.
stop us from giving it a 9. But like, it didn't quite get there. It wasn't, you know.
Quite. Yeah.
But this, I think it does. Again, tiny little flaws aside, which again, they're not enough to detract from it. I feel like a 10 is justified here. If this is, I think obviously this shouldn't be your first, you know, introduction to
No. Yeah.
the Whoniverse, but once you've got a good grasp on who the Daleks are, who Davroses are, this is essential listening. Like
I agree.
if you once you know who these characters are broadly from the TV show, if you're going to listen to any Big Finish audio, it's got to be this one. Yeah.
This is tough.
Hmm.
So I haven't given out a 10 before.
No, not yet. Because I only give it out once for Dalek. But
Yeah. Look, I can already imagine some of the stories that we're going to get to eventually from New Who that I would give 10s to, at least at this moment.
sure.
And those are the ones that really, really affect me.
Yeah.
Like, really leave some kind of resounding impact, whether it's emotionally or, like, thematically.
Yeah, sure.
Really, really relating to personal experiences that I can, that floor me.
Yeah, that's
true.
That's fair.
In general, like, and I'm thinking back to when I used to do movie reviews on my blog
Yeah.
that I've since abandoned, and I saved 10s for the stuff that, like, hours afterwards I was still thinking about.
Yeah, for sure.
Whiplash is a perfect example of this. Like, I'm not a drummer. I didn't personally relate to at least the setup of like Whiplash, but
but it's not about drumming.
No, exactly. Yeah, it's not about drumming. And when that story ended, I was like stunned and floored, and it stayed with me for a long time.
Yeah.
I think this is like, if this isn't a 10 for me, it's really, really close, which is really upsetting me because it's making this difficult.
No,
because I want to save 10s for like the big stuff.
Yeah, and that's understandable. And I think your point about the whole personal experience thing is well made because, as I said, I think some of my own personal lived experience is coming in here. That helps me identify with Davros a lot. As I said, and I know that, like, I said that it really affected me as a kid, but far from, you know, nostalgia, you know, waning and not being as good as I remember, I think it's even richer now that I'm an adult and I can understand all the nuances that are going on here. But obviously that my lived experience and my personal connection with the story probably is impacting it. And does look, your lived experience, you know, impacts the way you view your favorite Doctor Who stories.
Yeah, and I think that I know that everyone has different systems by which they rank things, which is in general why at times giving things a number scale isn't an amazing metric, which is funny that we're discovering this 52 episodes in.
Well, it's funny, but yeah, like I mean, I think it's good, you know, what we do. But yes, even I've often thought that quantifying art, you know, you wonder, that's not really possible, is it?
Exactly, because like there is no perfect 10 out of 10.
Yeah, like I said, there's no perfect story.
But like personally, my belief is that a 10 out of 10 is just a 9 out of 10 that hits you where you live. A
Yeah,
10 out of 10 is the kind of thing where it's like this is as close to perfect as it can get, and it's just got that little bit extra.
sure.
I think that this I'm gonna give it a 9. I'm gonna give it a
Sure.
9.
Yeah, that's
If I
fine.
had the option, I would give it a 9.5. I just
Yeah,
want that on record. But
yeah.
I think that there's like just that little thing that is holding me back from giving this a 10, and I don't know what that is yet.
No, that's fine.
Maybe I'll come to regret this score in the opposite direction.
Yeah, no, that's fine. And I mean, I think I maybe it's also because when I look ahead to where we've got to go with the revival series, for example. See, I wasn't even going to introduce it that bleakly, but I love the fact that you could just predict where that was going, which
Yeah,
I
I
just
know where you're going with that. It's me looking ahead. I'm like, oh, there's a lot of tens in my future, and you looking ahead, you're like, well, there's not much to look forward to.
Well, look, no. Like, in all seriousness, obviously there was some, stone cold classic,
Yeah.
future RTD episodes that we're going to be looking at. But in terms of your lived experience, and just with your experience with the show, the fact is, you enjoy a lot of Moffat's content more than I do. You
Yeah.
enjoy more of his content more than I do, and you've
Yeah.
watched more of his content more than I have. So purely for that reason, there are obviously going to be future stories that I may not have even watched for all I know, that are
Mm.
more likely to resonate with you personally than they would with me. I've gone on record and been very clear of the issues I have with Moffat's run. I'm sure that sentimentality element is going to crop up again, but
Mm.
that sort of proves your point that
Yeah.
it's that little bit of experience, the thing that the 10 is the thing that hits you where you live. Um, and
I
so I
mean,
think,
if it helps,
mm,
Moffat got a shot at writing Davros. This is obviously better and
oh
significantly better.
yeah,
Like,
God, I honestly don't think. I think somehow I've gotten to a weird rationalization state where I've sort of blocked out in my mind how much I fucking hated the
The Witch is
which is
familiar.
familiar. Yeah, and how stupid that ending was. Not
Hmm.
just because of the sentimentality, but how dumb and pointless and wacky, what a twist it was. But um, anyway, yeah, like this is a lot better than that. Um, but as I say, I think it does come down to that sort of personal experience thing. Obviously, these stories have hit you in a way that they probably haven't hit me, so that's why that's your standard.
I mean, I'll
You.
put it this way:
Mhm.
there is one episode of Peter Capaldi's run that everyone knows is brilliant,
Yeah,
and everyone knows is wonderful. And to me, that story is a 10, at least at the moment. I haven't
yeah. I
seen it
was
in a
gonna
couple of years
say,
now.
how does this compare to Heaven Sent?
Oof. This episode, Davros is as good a character study for Davros as Heaven Sent is a character study for the Doctor.
Mm, sure.
And I think I think that the character study in Heaven Sent is more impressive
Hmm.
than this is because the Doctor has so much more history and it has more uh, uh, appearances.
Mm,
The fact that they were able to get something like that out, even after all this time, that ties in all of that stuff so well, I
yeah,
think
sure.
is way more impressive. And also just because I've seen more of the Doctor than I have Davros, and I have more of a connection with that character.
Yeah, that's fair.
For me, it's difficult to. It's like even though I mentioned it, it's really close in
Mm,
Davros. It's really difficult for me to sympathize with him to the point
yeah,
that I'm like, uh, I think personally, and I'm not sure if this is correct, but I think you have a slightly easier job sympathizing with Davros than I do,
yeah.
for
Yes,
obvious reasons.
yeah,
You're a
I
fascist.
think
Um,
so.
no,
Sorry, what? I'm sorry,
no, no,
what?
no, you're not.
Yeah, anyway, no, I see what you mean though, because
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
it's
I just
that
think that it's the kind of that kind of thing where it's like that kind of stuff will resonate with you a little bit more, and I think that's why you're
for
more
sure.
likely to give
And I
this a 10
think,
than I am.
yeah, like I think, as I said, lived experience, I think, of being chronically ill and not like I don't know, like
Well, yeah, look, I mean, let's put it this
yeah,
way. Like, I think in general, with any media, your enjoyment of it is just a matter of how much of its flaws you're willing to look past.
Yeah,
We'll
for
put it that
sure.
way. With me, and we both brought up the one issue, really, and that is
Mm.
the fact that the impetus for getting the Doctor involved in the story was kind of weak.
Mm.
And that's really it. For me, looking at that flaw, it's kind of like, you were so close.
Mm.
With you looking at that flaw, it's like, nah, I don't care.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that would yeah, that makes sense. Actually, that reminds me of one small thing, and I'm almost positive I know the answer to this, but
Hmm?
right at the end when when the ship crashes, like was the doctor the one who did that? Because I think he was, because Kim had
He
injected herself
was,
with
yeah.
the yeah, okay,
He
no, that
was,
makes sense. Because there was a while when listening to this the first time, like, oh, I don't know, man. Does the Doctor have a lot to do in this story? I mean,
yeah.
what are we doing here? Are we
I
having
mean,
a repeat of the Sixth Doctor? And look, like he
yeah,
doesn't.
it's
He maybe not is not as involved as he was
well.
in
He
other
also,
stories, but he works.
yeah, I mean, he also saves like millions of people from the
Yes, that's
dome.
true. Yeah, I think before that point, I'm like, oh, he's just. I mean, he's just kind of sort of there, being his cheeky, mean-spirited little self. But as
Yeah,
you say,
yeah, I
he's the
think
one
he
who
has.
really makes it come together.
Yeah, and I think there's also there's more involvement with the Doctor even from like a character level in this than there is in Revelation.
Yeah, yeah,
Purely from the old from a lot of the parallels between the two characters, but
mm,
also the power play at TAI.
yeah,
Quite a lot of
absolutely.
there, and like the going back and forth on is
Mm,
Davros good, is he bad?
yeah,
Um,
because in Revelation they barely meet each other in
no,
that
yeah,
story.
barely at all.
Yeah, so they're able to correct that with this story, which is kind of great.
Yeah,
Um, yeah, so I just wanted to confirm that because yeah, okay, now that I've put that together, yes, I think I'm still going to stick with the 10 for this one.
yeah. Because
As you say, it's about what flaws can you look past? Because yes,
yeah,
the flaw is there. Like I'm not intellectually dishonest enough to say, well, what the fuck are you talking about, Cuff? No, yes, the flaw is there, but for me, the rest of it is so great. And again, I think, as you say, maybe it is that lived experience of being chronically ill and sort of seeing those nuances explored as much as they are here. Maybe that has got something to do with it as well.
so I'm seeing a lot of going back to the timescales right before we wrap up here. Like the majority of the reviews on the timescales are 10 out of 10 reviews. That's the
Yeah,
biggest
yeah.
bar. But there's also a few lower than 7.
Mm,
Um, for example, 5 people gave it a 6,
mm.
and then one person gave it a 5, one person gave it a 4, and one person gave it a 3. Um,
Oof.
I know. And I think among the 8s and 7s, I think, and something that people are uh, bringing up is the fact that it is like quite a long story, and it's a lot to sit through like in one go. And like
Mm.
I
Yeah,
saw
yeah,
someone, I
yeah.
saw someone go, well, the cliffhanger in the middle wasn't that impressive, and
Yeah, I read that. I think I looked at I looked up the time scales briefly before I did this, and I saw that comment. It's like, yeah, it's that cliffhanger. I mean, don't get me wrong. We've seen much worse
much
in
much worse. And
Doctor Who.
I just thought it was charming that they even did that because they didn't need to.
No,
But
not really,
it's
because
that
this
other.
wasn't.
Yeah,
Sorry,
but
go ahead.
it's just that extra level of like emulating the classic series. And I didn't
Yeah,
even think that like part of me was even like, oh, that's cute. They deliberately made the cliffhanger something that like isn't like was wrapped up pretty quickly afterwards and didn't factor in much afterwards either
yeah, yeah,
to emulate the classic series. I thought that's pretty cool.
yeah. It's funny.
But again, like there was people going, it's a bit too long, and a lot of the conversations pretty samey. And I'm sitting there going, okay, sure. And if you don't like that, fine. But I think that's like samey. I would disagree with because like, I think each
Mm.
conversation is doing something a bit different. Um, and when they are similar, it's in purpose of reinforcing a lot of the stuff that came before it.
Yeah, yeah, for sure, for sure.
And yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, look, I'm far be it from me to say that I think that in general, unless you're acting on like misinformation or from a
Mm.
an actively damaging standpoint, like bigots do,
Mm.
any review can be valid.
Yeah, yeah,
Like I could hear
yeah,
if
for sure.
someone like I would be interested in to hear why this person gave it a 3 out of 10
Mm.
because I very much don't see that.
Yeah,
But I could find myself agreeing with them from their point of view, right? Because again, that's all it
yeah,
is. There is
yeah,
no objectivity in any media.
yeah. Um,
There are things that get
yeah,
close.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
and I
But
think this is one of them. But yeah,
I mean, that goes to sort of a broader discussion of media, which I mean, I'm happy to discuss, but we don't have the
we're not
time.
absolutely not.
I guess, I want to bring up one small thing. I just want to go back to that opening monologue because, as I said, like it's a chilling monologue. It's pretty
Yes,
fucking terrifying. But like again, it was weird that as a kid, like I found it, um,
empowering.
again, like I could. Don't get me wrong. I could definitely see the darkness in it, and
Yes.
knowing it's fucking Davros. Of course, this is terrifying because we like what he says. This is not the end. This is only the beginning. We know what he means by that.
Yep.
We know that there's nothing good that's going to come out of it. But just for me personally, and especially growing up, there was something that I drew from that. The fact that he has a will to never be limited by his physical condition, which is something that I had to learn when I was a
Yeah.
kid, for a number of understandable reasons.
And I think that's also like when the Banes are talking about Davros later on,
Mm,
and Lorraine is talking about all the stuff that he brought up that like he had to get over or look past or whatever,
mm,
and then uh, Mr. Baines is like, "What about his disabilities?" And she goes, "No, he didn't mention that.
mm,
Like
mm,
the fact that he was like, this is a thing that happened to me, and I've moved past it, and it's not
yeah,
like something that I dwell on
yeah.
anymore."
Yeah, and there's a lot of those layers, which is quite interesting.
Yeah.
Anyway, so that's sort of how I felt about the opening monologue. But the funny thing is, and even as a kid, I noticed this. The total switch from that to the Doctor Who theme song.
Yeah.
It always made me like I think when I first
Well,
saw this,
especially
listened
the
to it.
it's especially the '80s theme, right?
Yeah,
Like the really dark
just
and menacing Davros talking about
to the
his
super kind of the
how he's gonna
jovial,
yeah
funky,
bum.
yeah, like to the super funky things like, oh, that's right, this is Doctor Who. I forgot about that. And we're right. So remember, Nick, this is the show with all the fun sci-fi romps. Gee, I can't wait to see what fun sci-fi romps we get up to today.
Mm.
What's that? It's about fascism and mass murder and awful capitalist things. Okay. Anyway, yeah. So that was just again, even as a kid, that was a bit of a jarring experience, but it's just kind of funny, I suppose.
Yeah,
But yeah. So I think we can conclusively say 9 out of 10 or 10 out of 10. This is a fantastic story, and
it's absolutely
everyone,
incredible.
once they're acquainted enough with the canon,
Mm.
go seek this out. Just
Yeah, like I said, I'll put a link to it in the description.
yeah, good, good.
Um, if you are a Doctor Who fan, this is an absolute essential
Yeah,
listen. If you have a spare 2.5 hours at any point in your week, give it a listen. You can listen in installments. That's the joy of any kind of audio medium. It's less of
yeah,
a
yeah.
commitment to like if this was a TV series special or a film, it's a bit more of a time sink. But I listened to
Yeah.
this on my way to and from the mall today. Basically, that was how I spent my time walking to Wollongong and back by listening
Neat,
to this. Um,
cool.
and it was time well spent. It was absolutely incredible.
Mm, it's great stuff.
So this brings us to the end of our second special episode in the run up to the 60th anniversary. I hazard a guess to say that next week will be our final special episode before launching into the actual 60th anniversary stories that we have to
Mm-hmm.
review.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I'm just going to tease this here. If those of you who listened into our To Who's Produce special
Mm.
episode last year, next time you might just be getting a little sequel to that where we continue to explore the stories of Phoebe Waller-Bridge's 18th Doctor.
Mm. Should be quite
Yep,
quite interesting.
yep. We've got a lot of great ideas.
Mm.
Stuff we haven't discussed with each other. A few things that we have,
Mm.
and I'm genuinely looking forward to continuing our tenure as showrunners.
Yeah. Should
Until then,
be
I'm
good.
Alex,
I'm Fitz.
and fascism equals bad, capitalism equals bad. Following To Who's Review equals good.